Everyone, thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to hop right into the agenda and ask the clerk to read the motion for convening into a closed meeting.
The recommendation is that a closed meeting of council be held on Monday, December 5th, 2022 at 5 p.m. in accordance with Section 239, subsection 2, Clause F, and Section 239, subsection 3.1 of the Municipal Act 2001 to consider the following. Number one, a position plan, procedure, criteria, or instruction to be applied to any negotiations carried on or to be carried on by or on behalf of the municipality or local board, and Section 239, subsection 3.1 for the purpose of education or training the members of council.
Thank you very much, Clerk. May I please have a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Martin. And may we please have a vote? All in favor? Fantastic. That has been carried. We will now head into a closed meeting. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. If we can move into the motion to reconvene an open meeting, having had our closed session, if the clerk would please read the recommendation.
Yes, the recommendation is that council reconvenes in open session at 7:00 p.m.
May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Dunstall, and those voting in favor of reopening to open. Fantastic. That is carried. So now we're going to move on to a moment of reflection. As we enter the holiday season, many of us are busy preparing to welcome friends and family for festive celebrations and stocking our fridges for annual family feasts. With the excitement for the holidays, it would be easy to forget the less fortunate members of our community across the region that are currently experiencing difficulties, including homelessness. The numbers are unprecedented. Like many communities across Canada, we are seeing the effects of poverty, mental health issues, rising housing costs, the impact of opioid crises firsthand in Waterloo Region. As a caring community, and in the spirit of giving, I encourage everyone to recognize the profound impact that each of you can have on the life and well-being of others with something as simple as a smile. If you are in a more fortunate financial position where you can, then please consider donating to groups such as the Wilmot Family Resource Centre, local food banks, or other charitable organizations to support those impacted by homelessness and those just struggling to make ends meet in Wilmot and across the region. Now I will pass it over to Councillor Cressman for our territorial land acknowledgement, please.
Thank you, Mayor. We have gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the arrival of the Europeans. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cressman. As for additions to the agenda, there was one correspondence that I wanted to note that was added since the original publication of November 30th, and that is the letter from the Honourable Steve Clark that is attached to the agenda for further reading should you want. Now to adopt the agenda, if I could please have the clerk read the recommendation.
The recommendation is that the agenda as presented for Monday, December 5th, 2022 be adopted.
May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Sadhu, seconded by Councillor Martin. And may we please have those voting in favor of adopting the agenda? Fantastic, that is carried. Now, looking for disclosure of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Councillors, does anybody have a pecuniary interest that they would like to declare? Okay. And now moving along to minutes of previous meeting. Clerk, would you please read the recommendation?
The recommendation is that the minutes of the following meetings be adopted as presented. November 7th, 2022, the regular meeting of council. November 21st, 2022, inaugural council meeting. And November 24th, 2022, council orientation.
So may I please have a mover to accept the recommendation? Moved by Councillor Dunstall. May I please have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. And those in favor? Fantastic. That is also carried. Now, this evening, we do not have any public meetings, nor do we have any presentations, so we are going to move along to the consent agenda. If members of council have any questions and want to remove an item from the consent agenda, please indicate so now, as we will not take questions on consent items unless the items are requested to be moved into the regular agenda. Councillors, does anyone want to pull anything forward? No? Okay, in that case, I would ask the clerk to read the recommendation for the consent items.
The recommendation is that the recommendations for consent items 11.1 to 11.6 be approved.
And may I please have a mover for that recommendation? Moved by Councillor Sadhu, a seconder? Moved by Councillor Martin. And those in favor of passing the recommendation? And that motion carries. Fantastic. And we are now moving into reports. So if I could please bring forward the Director of Infrastructure to present the first report.
Thank you, Mayor. This report recommends endorsement of the Baden Trunk Sewer Environmental Assessment Report with the preferred alignment identified in the report. The need for sanitary capacity to support current and future growth in Baden was identified as a key outcome of this study. 5 alternatives were presented to the public in 2 separate information sessions over the course of the last 2 years. These alternatives were then assessed for impacts to 5 factor areas, just as outlined within the report, and the study included with that as well. The preferred alternative, so alternative number 5, is looking to install a sanitary alignment along Christian Street, crossing the rail corridor and following the Baden Creek south to the Region of Waterloo's pumping station on Boundary Street. Following council endorsement, there's a 30-day period that's observed for the project file to remain on the public record, and so that's just an additional period of time for additional comments or that type of thing, if there are any. While in the process of concluding the report, staff also proceeded with the request for proposals to complete the detailed design and construction portion of this project, of the preferred alternative. The RFP terms of reference were posted publicly as well for interested bidders, and was closed a few weeks ago and evaluated. So based on the proposals received, staff are also recommending that the proposal submitted by MTE Consultants is awarded, and that they are in a position to complete the final design and approval works. That concludes my summary of the report. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Councillors, does anyone have any questions regarding this? Okay, with no questions, then I would ask the clerk to read the recommendation, please.
Okay. The recommendation reads that council take the following actions with respect to the class environmental assessment for the Baden Sanitary Trunk Sewer. Number 1, endorse the preliminary design to proceed with the design and construction of the preferred alternative, the Baden Sanitary Trunk Sewer Class Environmental Assessment Project File PWE-2022-42, dated December 5th, 2022, and 2, direct staff to file the Notice of Study Completion for this Municipal Class Environmental Assessment Schedule B study by means of posting the notice in the local newspapers, the township social media, direct mailings, and place the project file report on the public record for a period of 30 days. And that, following the 30 calendar day review period, the township proceed to the detailed design phase, contract document preparation, tendering, and construction administration of preferred alternative for construction of the Baden Sanitary Trunk Sewer, awarding MTE Consultants Incorporated the scope of work based on their proposal included in the RFP 2022-41 as submitted on November 9th, 2022 at a cost of $495,000, $541 plus HST. And that staff be directed to execute the consulting engineering agreement document required for MTE Consultants Incorporated to proceed with the scope of services and tasks contained in the proposal document. And finally, that staff be directed to gain approvals and acquire lands needed in order to construct the preferred alternative.
Thank you very much. May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, and may I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Cressman. And those voting in favor? And that motion carries. On to 12.2 is the Hamilton Road pedestrian crossing. I will pass it back to Mr. Molyneux, please, for a presentation of the report.
Thank you, Mayor, and apologies for that long recommendation on the previous report. This report is for the Hamilton Road pedestrian crossover. Don't be alarmed by the term crossover. It's not a bridge or any sort of structure. It's just the reference to the facility type as outlined through the Ministry of Transportation and all the traffic manuals that speak to those types of facilities. So Again, this report outlines the review and siting selection process for this pedestrian active transportation crossing on Hamilton Road. The crossing is being considered in advance of construction in advance of the Employment Lands multi-use trail connection to that point, and largely due to the current crossing needs and the current traffic environment on Hamilton Road. So the recommendation is a pedestrian crossover with activated crossing signals that give the pedestrian the right of way to cross. Based on the current and future use, the travel destinations associated across the right of way, and the likelihood of users to want to use the facility in that particular location, staff are recommending endorsement of the facility at the south leg of Captain McCallum Drive. Construction of this feature will take place in 2023. There are a few locations where crossovers have been implemented within the township to date. A few of them are township and a few of them are region. Our plan, as was with previous installations, would be we would find it beneficial to have our staff on site while the first few days of active use are taking place, as well as having the regional police present as well. So that is part of the plan for implementation. Again, construction will be in 2023, subject to the council endorsement this evening. We'll continue on with the detailed design process and the construction organization process. So that'll take place over the winter, and then hopefully in Q1 or Q2 of next year, we'll be in a position to construct that facility. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Councillors, are there any questions? Yes, Councillor Cressman.
Through the mayor, there's a portion of the connection to the bridge over the Nith River that doesn't have sidewalks. In what time frame are those sidewalks anticipated?
Through you, Mayor. Booley Street is on the reconstruction schedule in the next few years. We just issued an RFP and closed it this past summer to award design. So there is a trail component that will connect through Booley and Victoria. There are currently no plans on Riverside for any form of trail connection, but those are certainly being looked at just to create that connectivity piece. We are also looking at Hamilton Road. There's a few segments of sidewalk and connecting pieces that have to be completed as well, though I don't think that there's too much that would not be able to be incorporated with this facility that allows for that connection on Hamilton Road.
Any additional questions, councillors? Okay, so with that, I will ask for the clerk to please read the recommendation.
The recommendation is that council endorse the construction of a level 2 type B pedestrian crossover at the south leg of the intersection of Hamilton Road and Captain McCallum Drive in New Hamburg.
May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Martin. And those in favor? And that motion has also carried. Moving on to our next report, which is 12.3, Bill 23, More Homes Built Faster Act of 2022. I will please pass it over to the Director of Development Services to present the report.
Thank you, Mayor Salomon. I wish I could say this is a straightforward report and a straightforward piece of legislation, but quite frankly, it's not. It's an omnibus bill that affects many pieces of legislation, and all the impacts are not fully known yet, but they're starting to become clear in some respects. As you know, Bill 23 was introduced on October the 25th, the day after the municipal election, and it was posted to the ERO, the Environmental Registry of Ontario, for consultation until November 24th. And then on November 23rd, that consultation was extended until December the 9th. And then royal assent was given on the 28th. Notwithstanding the consultation had been extended, the final decision, the final approval was given on the 28th. Much of Bill 23 stems from the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report. That was February of 2022. It was released with 55 recommendations to the government on how to build 1.5 million houses in the next 10 years. And then quite quickly after that, the Bill 109 was introduced, And it actually received royal assent 2 weeks into its 4-week consultation period. So certainly the path of posting things for consultation and making decisions before the consultation period ends is fairly ingrained. Mr. Martin will be giving a report on Bill 109 following this report on Bill 23. Most of the Bill 109 was the initial steps of implementing the Housing Task Force report, and most of them kick in on January 1st of 2023. And pretty much we're focused on reducing red tape, and Bill 23 takes it to the next level, expanding on those first changes of Bill 109. And I'll highlight a few of the changes contained within the report, but not at the same level of detail. Perhaps the most significant change is the elimination or redesignation of the region as a regional municipality without planning authority. On the surface, that seems pretty straightforward. The township would then be tasked with approving subdivisions, condominiums, official plan amendments. But there's a lot of missing parts within that. The municipality may gain some manner of self-determination through that process, but there's a lot of planning functions that haven't been addressed. Source protection, and all the various aspects of housing approvals that the region, as the housing authority for water the region provides, who's going to do what. And a lot of those questions have been raised in various municipalities, various reports across the province. And quite frankly, it would seem that Bill 39 will probably address a lot of the missing pieces of Bill 23. So without obviously having a lot of details on what Bill 39 will mean and what the facilitator still to be announced will bring to the table. Certainly some of the missing components, such as transferring planning authority to the local level without transferring responsibility for critical infrastructure like sewage treatment plants and water supply wells. Quite frankly, whoever's controlling the sewage treatment plant capacity and the water supply is going to control where growth happens in Waterloo region. So simply transferring planning authority does not necessarily, in the Bill 23 sense, complete the task that perhaps was envisioned. Some of the other components of Bill 23, gentle density on demand. Previous changes had required us as municipalities to allow 2 units in the main dwelling on a property, 1 in a detached dwelling, additional residential unit, if you will. This ups the ante a little bit by allowing that now 3 dwellings can be created within the main dwelling. So we will need to update some of our bylaws, but really it's an effective way to create density. The only thing from a staff perspective that we would certainly caution is using the term gentle density or soft density, which is pretty predominant. There's really nothing soft about it to the residents in these established neighborhoods with construction happening for 4 to 6 months, creating the units. Again, it's a beneficial outcome in the creation of new dwellings and affordabilities and ranges of housing, but deeming it soft is a little bit of an exaggeration, and we certainly don't experience that when we see these projects going into neighborhoods. We receive a lot of feedback, and it's generally not positive because change is difficult in any neighborhood to address. Bill 23 also, the initial version, removed third-party appeals. And again, that targets speeding up approvals processes, removing third parties from frivolous or vexatious appeals, whatever you want to refer to them, that bogged down the system and created delays. A lot of NIMBY type appeals would be addressed by that. From housing advocates, certainly thought that was a great idea. It would speed up the process. It was something in Bill 23 that actually, as controversial as removing the rights of appeal and the perceived impediments on the democratic process, certainly it would have the effect of speeding up approvals. Through the committee stage, those prohibitions were rolled back. Official plan amendments and zoning bylaws would now be subject to third-party appeals. And from that perspective, it kind of undermined the effectiveness of the bill. If the goal is really to improve the development approvals process, as controversial as it may have been, that was a pretty significant change that would have the effect of speeding up development approvals. So that has been rolled back, and again, the effectiveness of the bill then, it's a little bit less than what was originally promised. Changes to the Ontario Land Tribunal, the OLT, have the effect of perhaps keeping that by changing the rules of the game such that third-party appeals if you're going to go to the OLT and file an appeal and you lose, chances are pretty high that you're going to be paying the winner's bills. And that's a fairly significant, it's always been there that for a frivolous or vexatious appeal, the board could award costs, but it's pretty rare that that's ever happened. And now it appears that it's a clear direction from the province to the OLT that the loser pays the winner's costs. So that will still be, obviously, something to keep an eye on, but it certainly does affect that process. And so it creates a mixed message, if you will. On one hand, we were going to take away appeals, then we're putting them back in, but then we're saying that if you lose the appeal, you're going to pay the other guy's costs. It's not as clear-cut as what was promised, that this is going to speed up approvals and make clear-cut housing decisions. Conservation authorities' roles obviously is very controversial, being restricted back to the core fundamentals of flooding control, not being able to comment on planning applications, and municipalities actually not being able to contract conservation authorities and use their expertise that we've relied on for all these years to provide that comment to us. They're taking completely out of the process. Our understanding is that many of these changes may stem from the experiences of the province and other communities with their conservation authorities. I want to emphasize that we've worked collaboratively with Grand River Conservation Authority in this township for many, many years. We don't have a problem with GRCA holding up processes or simply, stalling procedures that could proceed faster. And quite frankly, I think if the province wanted to address impediments to development processes in Wilmot and probably regionally and provincially, the processes of MTO would be a better one to perhaps address in terms of the timeliness of Ministry of Transportation's comments on applications and those processes. But certainly that could be a suggestion that would be appropriate for the province to consider. Other little details that have weight but not necessarily are really that effective. Eliminating the public meeting on a subdivision application would seem to be something that speeds up a process, but it would be pretty rare that a subdivision application would ever be submitted without a zoning bylaw amendment to implement that plan of subdivision. Zoning bylaw still has a public meeting, so notwithstanding that the public meeting for a subdivision is eliminated, it really was a duplicate meeting anyway, so it has no real impact on the speed of getting housing approvals. There's some parkland dedication changes. Traditionally, municipalities can dictate where they want parks, what they're configured, and the quality of the land that's being assumed. The changes to the act are saying that now developers can say, I prefer you to take this piece, and if the municipality refuses to accept the piece due to its location or its quality, that would be something that could be appealed to the OLT. So it would seem that it's probably moving some of the authority of municipalities to the development industry, at least in respect of parkland, which is a concern. Site plan control, you've heard a lot of talk in the media about the green building standards. It's probably less of a concern in Wilmot at this stage. We are working with our regional partners to look at the opportunities. Whether that comes through site plan or not, certainly in larger buildings would be a concern in the cities perhaps. The biggest concern for the municipality obviously on site plan control would be that structures of 10 units or less are exempt from site plan approval. Our concern as staff would be that typically site plan approval is how we have governed the development, how it fits to the neighborhood, lot grading, drainage, stormwater management, parking layout in rear yards, including screening of rear yard parking to ensure that headlights at night aren't shining into neighbors' yards. Those kind of aspects, we will now have to find new means by which to address those, whether it's by amending our building bylaw in terms of what we require prior to building permit, but also zoning changes in terms of requiring rear yard parking lots to be screened appropriately for light transmission to neighbors' properties. So certainly it's going to require us to think outside the box and create new solutions to address some of the issues that matter to residents. And I think eliminating site plan approval on 10 units probably doesn't really speed up the process, but it certainly has the potential to negatively impact on existing neighborhoods. Ontario Heritage Act has had a number of changes made, significant changes that will impact how our Heritage Committee moves forward. We have over 100 properties on our non-designated registry. Changes to that registry will say that if a property hasn't been moved forward to full designation within 2 years, it's removed from the registry for a timeout, if you will, of 5 years before it can be considered for reintroduction. So certainly it will demand that our Heritage Committee, Heritage Wilmot, who do a great job of identifying resources, that we prioritize the existing list to ensure that we have the best opportunity to save and protect the heritage of properties that are most critical to the municipality. And then moving forward, obviously, to be very strategic in terms of how we advance properties to designation. Certainly one key is ensuring that, willing property owners are obviously a lot easier to deal with in terms of designating properties than properties where there is some hesitation to allow for designation. Other matters, the Greenbelt swap is obviously big in the media right now, lots of talk across the province. Doesn't really impact Wilmot Township that much. Obviously, it's akin to our countryside line, the green belt. We have heard people, question the threat to the countryside line in Wilmot Township. From a staff perspective, I don't feel that this legislation impacts the countryside line at all. It's more the approval of the regional proposed amendment number 6 that came out of the Municipal Comprehensive Review that's before the province right now. That sets out the proposed growth strategy to 2051 for Waterloo Region. And in terms of the countryside line, Wilmot has over 300 hectares of land inside the countryside line. ROPA 6 that's proposed would use 50 of those hectares. So certainly Wilmot has considerable amount of land inside our countryside line, that the countryside line itself is not per se under threat in Wilmot Township, or probably even regional. But what could happen through that approval of ROPA 6 is that the province may do what it's done in other regional municipalities, which is add lands for designation for growth to 2051. Having said that, certainly regionally, there are a lot of lands inside the countryside line that were not addressed through ROPA 6. So I would, certainly it's a consideration, but I don't know that the countryside line is under threat by Bill 23. It could be under threat potentially through the consideration of ROPA 6. And then there's another piece of legislation that has been identified by Bill 23, the merger of the provincial policy statement, the PPS, with the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Combining those documents to simplify provincial planning direction probably is a good move. It makes a lot of sense, but without knowing what that's going to look like, it's difficult for staff at this point to convey to you what the impact on Wilmot would be. But certainly, it would be our intention, obviously, to monitor and participate in those discussions. And at such time as we are aware of what the plan is, we would bring that back to council in a report to provide you with updates on that. So I'll leave it at that for now. I'm not sure if Director Kelly is available remotely yet to summarize the development charges component of this act. Obviously, it's a fairly significant component. I would be able to try to answer some of your questions on that, but
Yeah, through you, Mayor, he just said he'd be a couple of moments.
So from that perspective, if you would like questions on the planning side of it, I'd be happy to do that until he's available.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Okrafka. Are there questions for Mr. Okrafka while we wait for Mr. Kelly to join us? Yes, Councillor Cressman.
Through the mayor, there was some reference to having to move the money out of parkland reserves in a certain timeline without having it sitting there and finding the best utilization of it over time. How do you see that playing out, and will that tie the township's hands on that?
Through you, Mayor Solomon, to Councillor Cressman. Mr. Kelly can probably answer that as well. I see that he's live and in person now on the screens. But it is a concern because we do have a significant parkland reserve with plans to use it. And so I think that's one of the clarification pieces that the province really hasn't rolled out yet is on these requirements, is it to allocate it or is it to actually spend it? Actually spending it would be, seem to be not the best plan for the prudent use of resources. Simply having to allocate it towards a project is probably a much more prudent approach, but I'll let Mr. Kelly respond to that as well.
Sure. Just checking my audio. It's okay. Yep. Okay. Through you, Mayor Sellen, thanks for the question and for your patience. Yeah, we struggled with the language and terminology on that as to what Mr. Okrafka said about allocating versus usage. Traditionally, parkland funding has been instrumental in larger scale recreation and parks infrastructure projects for the municipality. We go through an extensive 10-year capital forecast where we fund various initiatives through various funding sources, as council is aware. It's a critical piece to just have to use it arbitrarily within a certain number of years doesn't really follow along with prudent financial planning. So along with other area treasurers and I would say CFOs across the province, some concerns about the implementation piece of that and I guess more to be found out during the regulations portion of the legislation.
Thank you. Any other questions on the development side before we move on to development charges? Sorry. No? Okay, then I would ask Mr. Kelly to please proceed with your part of the report.
Timing couldn't have worked out any better, so thank you, Mr. Okrafka, for your extensive overview of the report. So, yeah, I guess as the report outlines, some very significant concerns over the impact on development charges through this legislation. There has been rhetoric, or I shouldn't say rhetoric, there has been a lot of conversation out there at the provincial level about the status of development charges across the province and within our region specifically. It's worth noting, and it was noted in the report, that a lot of that analysis and projections and math essentially was done in isolation without contacting treasurers of municipalities or those responsible for the DCs. From Wilmot's perspective, we're currently sitting in a situation where we have a significant deficit within our development charges reserve funds. At the end of 2021, it was at a deficit of $3.7 million. We're reliant upon development charge collections over the long term, not only just to rebuild up and pay back what's existing in debt charges to fund that deficit, but also to fund future growth. This legislation, as I indicated in the report, has a significant impact on our ability to do that, not only just to fund previous projects that put us in this deficit situation, but also to collect on future capital. Our current capital forecast predicts about $122 million worth of capital spending over the next 10 years, and 40% of those expenditures are funded from development charges. We went with the approach constantly that growth should pay for growth and ought to pay for growth. The DC regime, how it was structured, was in order to do that. The challenge right now, which is noted in the report, that in the absence of any sort of transitional assistance from the province for the implementation of Bill 23, we'll have to look to other sources to pay for growth, and those sources would ultimately include the property tax base or user fees, which in our situation is our water and wastewater. Essentially, we had fairly low development charges historically in Wilmot Township. We just got them up to a reasonable level. We just started to collect to get us in a spot where growth was paying for growth, and it seems like that's being taken away in a lot of areas. So there's language within the report that speaks to consistent feedback across the province through AMO, through the Ontario Regional Single Tier Treasurers. A lot of concerns over DCs, but as you'll see later in the council package this evening and in the correspondence, I believe there is some comments out there, early comments, or early, I guess newer comments, not that early, we would like to hear them much sooner, that there may be some relief potentially on the way in a revenue neutrality standpoint, but a lot to hear on that yet. So happy to take any questions on the DC side of things, and I wish I had a happier story to tell on it, but it doesn't look that happy right now.
Through you, Mayor.
Yes, Councillor Dunstall.
Did I read that the province was considering paying the shortfall for those DC charges, and also that there was going to be an audit done?
Through you, Mayor Salonen. I guess the fact-based piece of it, there is a letter out that's in the agenda that says that through the ministry that they will consider trying to make this revenue neutral. There isn't in-depth detail as to how they project to do that. As far as the audit of DC reserve funds, essentially there is an audit every year of them through the FIR, financial information return process that goes into the province that shows them the status of development charges for all of the municipalities that collect development charges across the province. So whether there's more in-depth audits, we're on a wait and see for that.
Thank you.
Any other questions, councillors? Councillor Cressman?
Is there any way of rolling up across the province how much debt is secured by development charges reserves so that we can get a fulsome picture rather than maybe the narrative that appears to be constructed by the provincial government on the reserves that are out there?
Through you once again, Mayor Sallin. I think it's right now the way that the financial information return to the province is structured, it is somewhat misleading. It'll show a large dollar value in some instances within DC reserve funds, but doesn't show what proportion of that is debt finance, because the debt financing stays on the general levy side of the books, I guess, as it would be in municipalities. We have, I do sit as a representative on the board for the Municipal Finance Officers Association, and we have been in communication with the Ministry and Ministry of Finance to find a mechanism or tool that can make it more explicit and more obvious the situation rather than the way it's displayed right now or the way the information can be displayed. But what I can share is just from Wilmot's perspective, starting next year, we will look to be in a better situation from a development charges reserve fund standpoint, and that's because the Township of Wilmot just issued a fairly significant amount of debt in the fall of 2022 here to help out on the cash flow side. So a lot of that balance will be debt financed, and your point is well understood. We do need to roll that up to the province across all municipalities to show the true picture.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, councillors? Councillor Cressman?
And not to dominate, but I might swing back to through the mayor back to Harold on the Ontario Land Tribunal and assessing costs from the winner to the loser, and that didn't get modified, as I understand, in the changes that were made to Bill 23. That still stands, and that's a key piece of information that needs to be communicated if it stands into the future. I mean, maybe that's a statement rather than a question.
Through you, Mayor Sallin, and that's my understanding as well, is that it hasn't changed. I think the interpretation of what all that might include might go beyond simply the legal costs of the hearing and extend to lost revenues, lost success, depending on what the application is. It could be a significant charge. Again, getting some more details on that will be important, but certainly it could be a significant change that, for all practical purposes, might eliminate third-party appeals all unto itself.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kelly and Mr. Okrafka, for sharing that. I would please ask that the clerk read the recommendation.
The recommendation reads that Report DS 2022-027 be forwarded to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing as Wilmot's comment on Bill 23, and that applicable components of Report DS 2022-027 be posted to the Environmental Registry of Ontario in response to ERO's postings 019-6163, the Planning Act, and 019-6172 under the Development Charges Act, and 019-6196 under the Heritage Act.
May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Wilkinson, and may I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Cressman. All of those in favor? And that motion carries. Thank you. Moving on to our next report, another bill. Bill 109, impacts on planning service delivery. I will now ask the Director of Development Services to again present us this report.
Thank you, Mayor Solomon. I'll speak to it on behalf of the department here as Manager of Planning. As Mr. Kraft explained a little bit earlier, Bill 109 was the first piece of legislation that rolled out following the province's Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report. Specifically to the Planning Act, the Bill 109 deals with ways to incentivize municipalities to streamline planning approvals. That's the way it's worded. There are some potential issues with the thought that the processing time falls on processes that the municipality has entirely within its control. One of the largest items that we see falling short in this legislation is that there are a number of means of during the development review process that are outside of the municipality's control, whether it be public agency comments, the time frame required to get comments back from an applicant. Any number of those processes delay the ultimate decision-making process. So that's kind of the main concern with the legislation. Having said that, certainly staff recognize that we will continue to work through opportunities to streamline planning review processes. In 2020, the Regional Waterloo and area municipalities undertook a Lean Six Sigma planning review process to basically look at ways, before this legislation was in place, ways to streamline planning approvals specific to zoning applications and official plan amendment processes throughout the region. It was clear actually through that process that the Township of Wilmot was actually working fairly effectively. The benefit of a small municipality is there are maybe not as many steps in the process, and that was very clear based on some of our the cities that were involved in that process and the number of steps that were required to go from point A to point B that are outside of the legislated requirements of the Planning Act. So certainly we've kind of through that process demonstrated that we're working fairly effectively. For instance, a zone change application, the prescribed time frame is 90 days, and our average was somewhere in the 80, I have it in my report here, but about 84 days, I believe, was our average. So we were working effectively. This legislation deals with the removal or the refund of planning application fees if applications aren't processed within prescribed timeframes. So dealing with zone change applications and site plan approvals specifically. So the Lean Six Sigma process didn't look at site plan approvals. So staff undertook just a quick look at a capture of the timeframes that we've processed site plan applications rather over the last number of years. It's very clear that we aren't processing them within the 60-day time frame that's prescribed by the Planning Act. But the interesting piece in looking at the applications processed over this last number of years was in the majority, if not all of the applications, there was a time frame of about 90 days within the review process that the municipality was waiting for comments back from the applicant or external agencies. So with a 60-day window to approve something and to retain the planning fees, when we take 90 days to get a comment back, makes it pretty difficult, obviously, to process the fees. So that's, that's maybe a shortfall in the legislation. But again, certainly there's always opportunities, and we continue to work with work with other municipalities to look at ways we can streamline processes and ultimately come up with consistent terms of references for studies, and basically so that consultants and applicants that work throughout jurisdictions in the region of Waterloo can expect to go through similar processes, which, if the expectations are clear at the outset of an application, perhaps, some of those efforts to streamline the process are easier to follow through. So with all of that said, there are a couple areas that we see that we would follow through as initial solutions to hopefully streamline processes and kind of retain as many of those, as much as the submission fees as we can. The fee structure for planning applications is basically cost recovery. So we identify the cost of processing an application. If we aren't retaining those fees, then we're not paying, development isn't paying for development. So certainly we want to look at ways that we can retain those application fees. The one first thing that we've been looking at, we've been working collaboratively with the other municipalities, is to look at a more robust pre-submission consultation process. So studies that are required in support of an application to ensure that the terms of reference is very clearly spelt out. So we know exactly what we're looking for, and the applicant or consultants are very clear on what they need to submit. There would be instances that we'd also be looking to see some of those studies pre-approved before an application is filed. So basically front-loading the process, so we have some of those technical reports are addressed up front before we get into the approval stage. So whether it be a traffic study or a functional servicing report, we know that those technical aspects are dealt with in advance, so then we're left with kind of the review process, but we don't have questions about technicalities. So that would certainly help in expediting some of that process, because reviewing those reports, having third-party consultants look at those certainly does add a measure of number of days into that process. So we're hopeful if we can upfront some of those reviews and to have a very robust terms of reference and pre-consultation process before the actual timeframes of the Planning Act kick in, we can continue to process applications quickly and hopefully retain those submission fees. The other component is actually adjusting fee structures. So Council will see that through the budget process, that we've proposed changes to the fee structure for planning services. Part of that is to pull out different components of the application and charge on the basis of the service provided. So for instance, the cost of notifying and sending out circulations for public meetings. So pulling that out of the actual application cost, because it's a service related component. The cost of holding public meetings, incurred costs, legal costs, peer review costs. So separating those in the fee structure. So the application fee represents the processing piece, but some of the services that tie into that process are pulled out. So essentially, we would feel that, the actual application fee may be refunded if we can't process within the prescribed timeframes, but some of those processes that tie into it will have collected and not had to return those fees. So that's basically the nature of the fee structure proposed that you'll again see through that budget process. Another component is the utilization of holding provisions. So we have policies in our official plan that allow us to provide a recommendation for an application to be approved with a holding provision. So the land use would be decided. Basically, the application decision is in place, but the holding provision allows for other components that haven't formally been addressed to be dealt with before the use can actually occur. So for instance, if there's servicing constraints, an application could be approved with a holding provision to say that yes, it can be used for X number of units, but before it happens, that they have to verify that the servicing infrastructure is in place to support it. So that would allow some of those, we can use it for a number of aspects, but potentially allowing for the decision to be made within the time frame, putting the holding provision in place, then all kind of the extenuating items that are outside of the actual land use can be dealt with after the fact, and so then the actual decision is made within those prescribed timeframes. And the last piece that we would generally not want to utilize, but certainly exists, is the opportunity to provide recommendations for council to refuse an application. We certainly don't use that very often. We've kind of take pride that we were able to work through most of the issues before it gets to council for a decision, but in some instances, if we're not getting responses in a timely fashion, or if there's some issues that we just don't see can be addressed within the timeframes and we don't have a solution to move forward, it may be appropriate then to make a recommendation to refuse an application, in which case, again, the decision is then made within the prescribed timeframes. So those are our initial steps that we kind of see to kind of help work through some of that planning delivery and hopefully, retain the fees that are required to pay for the services provided. Certainly, we will continue to monitor that through the coming year. Initially, the fee refunds were anticipated to come into place January 1st, but I think the correspondence indicates in the council package, I believe in that letter, speaks to the potential of legislation being introduced to postpone that till July. So there may be an extension to when that that process kicks in. But certainly we're planning to put the tools in place to be ready for when that occurs, regardless of whether it's January or July. And then again, as Mr. Kraft explained, there's a lot of things happening with other bills, specifically Bill 23, and we'll need to monitor the implications of that and see how that affects, our development review process and, adjust accordingly. And I'll leave my comments at that and certainly can answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin, and my apologies for misdirecting who was doing the report, but I really appreciate that. Councillors, do we have any questions? Councillor Dunstall.
Yeah, thanks. Through you, Mayor Salonen. I just wanted to make sure I understood. So the time frame, the 90 days or whatever it's going to be, starts the minute the application is submitted. And the front-end loading would be part of them putting that information in the application. Is that correct?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Salonen. So initially before an application is filed, the pre-submission process is where that front-ending would occur. We then have an opportunity, I believe it's 30 days, I might be wrong because some of those timeframes have changed, but basically to deem an application to be complete. So once we actually receive an application and all of the materials that go along with it, we would look at that, determine that everything we identified through the pre-submission process has been submitted with the application, and then once we deem the application complete, then the timeframe would fall back to when the application was submitted, but we have a period of time to deem it to be complete.
Any other questions, councillors? Oh, Councillor Sidhu.
It's not so much a question as just kind of a general statement. I'm just reading through here that if this was passed in the previous years, it wouldn't really make a whole lot of impact on Wilmot because our processing times are within the time frame. As compared to cities like Toronto, I just basically wanted to say it's a kudos to our staff who are streamlining the process already. This bill, I think, essentially is targeting more of the GTA and the larger cities, and I don't think it will have too much of an impact on Wilmot. And yeah, that was just.
Thank you very much, Councillor Sidhu. Any final questions? Councillor Cressman?
I guess it was my concern if it's enacted that what you have is an incentive for not answering questions with a submission because you get cheaper fees. And to my mind, that's the wrong incentive in the whole process.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cressman. Last call for questions regarding the report before us. Okay, thank you. In that case, I will have the clerk please read the recommendation.
The recommendation is that report DS 2022-026 be received for information.
May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Sidhu. And those in favor? Great, and that has been carried. That comes to the end of our reports. We're now moving into correspondence. I want to note that there are two pieces of correspondence coming from the Honourable Steve Clark, the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. All of Council, including myself, have read them, and should the general public want to read them, they are available on the website with the agenda. We'll now be moving on to bylaws, and I would ask that the clerk please read the recommendation.
The recommendation is that the bylaws as attached to this agenda be read a first, second, and third time and finally passed in open council on this date.
And may I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, and a seconder, Councillor Sidhu. And those in favor? And that motion is carried. Now, there are no additional notices of motion for this meeting, so I will move on to announcements. We just have one this evening, which is the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Tomorrow, December the 6th, is the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, also known informally as White Ribbon Day. This day is commemorated in Canada each December 6th as the anniversary of the 1989 L'École Polytechnique massacre. This is a day of remembrance, but also a day that stands for change against the violence that occurs to women all around the world. The flags at the administrative complex will be lowered to half-mast, and community members are encouraged to observe a minute of silence during the day and to wear a white ribbon as a commitment to end violence against women. Councillors, may I ask if there are any other announcements you'd like to make tonight? Okay. And then with that, we have no business arising from closed session, so we will move on to the confirmatory bylaw that I would please ask the clerk to read the recommendation.
The recommendation is that the confirmatory bylaw as attached to this agenda be read a first, second, and third time and finally passed in open council on this date.
May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Wilkinson, and a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Dunstall. All those in favor? And that motion is passed. On to the fun part, adjournment. So I will read the recommendation that we now adjourn to meet again at the call of the mayor. May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconder, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? And officially we are adjourned.